the first thing we're going to do is go and look at our use server, so actually where we can configure the devices. So first thing we do, we actually, before we even get to devices or rooms, we set up a location tree. So we can actually base rooms all over the world and actually geolocate them in a tree structure. So essentially this can match any of your existing systems, but actually so you can easily find where that room is and be able to know where that is instantly. And then we onboard a room. So for example, here I've got my boardroom, and this is actually going to be the room that we'll be using throughout the entire demo. So you'll see a common theme here in terms of devices and the elements that we're going to be looking at and controlling. But obviously the first thing we need to do is onboard devices into the system. So this room, as you can see, is already pre-set up. But if I wanted to onboard a device, I would simply go to add a device. I can go to our driver library, and essentially I can search to see all of the devices that we currently have support for. So you'll see currently there are 1,219 drivers available. And as mentioned, a driver is a unique integration to an API. So you'll see some of these have multiple model numbers listed. And especially if we look at one of the display manufacturers, lots of models listed here because each one of those sizes will use the same API. So that 1,200-ish drivers will use somewhere in the region of 3,000 to 5,000 different unique models of support. What we do, we would simply download the driver for the device that we want to onboard. So again, we've got some pre-prepared here. And essentially to configure that device, I can show you one I've done earlier. We'd give it a friendly name. So for example, GoudaPDU. We choose a model from the drop-down list. And again, this one, they're very similar models, but if I had something like a display, you can see again, we get all the size of the display that is supported by that particular driver. And then we tell the system how we're going to communicate with it. So we can do things like onboard a host name or IP address. And then for some devices, they're also going to require a username and password to be able to onboard that. Once we've done that, we click File Save, and that device is being monitored. Essentially, all of the brains have been built into the back end of the driver. So essentially, we have the ability to poll that device on an interval for all of the information it has to offer. And instantly you've got access to all of the commands available, so you can actually control that device from the system. Okay. The only other thing really that we're going to set up here as part of the demo is going to be some of our, what we would term as self-healing scenario. So a really important thing that we actually implement is when we build out these systems, but to actually determine the use cases for when a self-healing scenario take place. So essentially where we've got something that's determined as an issue in a space, or something's not in optimal, it's not in a compliant state, so it's not working the way it should be. But we can actually detect that and put that right without having to have a user step in or a technician step in and actually make that change. So a good example of that, you can see here, I've got my self-titled display source self-healing. So if we detect that a display is currently powered on and it's not on HDMI source, essentially that's not in a compliant state for us because it should always be HDMI in this environment. So therefore we will actually come in and when we actually control this, you can see that we've actually got this set up. So if it's not on HDMI, we instantly set it back after 5 seconds. And then we actually do some logging, so we can actually come through and see how many times that's happened. So we can still, as a support desk, make note of any of the self-healing scenarios that have taken place and actually report that back to the business as, we've not only fixed maybe 15 issues a month through user intervention, but we've also fixed this other 30 or however many issues through self-healing, and they were fixed within 5 seconds of the fault being detected. Essentially, as I mentioned, the only thing we do there is configuration of the space, and we do have quicker ways of deploying this. You don't have to do this manually every time. For example, we can do things like clone spaces. So essentially, you can keep all of those settings in there and just update IP addresses. Or we can do what we would term mass deployment, where essentially you feed us a template like this, so a room configured in for each one of your room types, and then essentially an Excel sheet with all the information that changes per room. So typically IP address and maybe screen size, and we can mass deploy as many rooms as you have instantly.